Thank you so much, first of all, for joining us tonight. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. It is about how to give effective and memorable presentations that your audience will enjoy, and hopefully you will enjoy this one. As Sherry said, I have a master's in technical writing. I just got that, I earned that in 2019. So I was one of those older students that went back to school to get my master's degree. Totally worth it. But I highly recommend getting your master's degree when you don't have two small kids at home. It's really difficult. So I will say that what I learned from that, one of my favorite classes, honestly, was the theory of technical communications. And that is what inspired this presentation. There is a research article that I'm going to reference throughout that really struck me as being extremely, so some of those, sometimes you hear or read something that's like, oh my God, and it just sticks with you. That's what this was. And that's what sort of translated into this presentation. In addition to that, I'm, like Sherry said, I'm UX certified, and part of my master's and part of my UX certification was about accessibility. So I dovetailed that into this presentation. And so that's going to be kind of a little bit closer to the end, but I'm going to weave in some accessibility tips throughout this presentation. So without further ado, I will get started. So we're going to cover 4 principles in this presentation, 3 of which are actually came from the research article. So the first one is to build your talk on messages. So when you're creating a presentation, it's important that you create a message and sort of a theme throughout, and not really topics. I'll explain that here in a minute. You're going to support those messages with visual evidence when possible, and not bulleted lists. And I will argue this is not a bulleted list on your screen. It's a numbered list. But try to avoid those bulleted lists. I'm going to explain why in a little bit. And then you're going to explain your evidence by fashioning words on the spot and avoiding reading from a script. And then the 4th one isn't from the research article that is noted down here in the footer. And I put those links should be in the chat. If you really want to dig into a research article, I actually found it interesting, but it is noted in the bottom. But the accessibility part of this presentation is really more from my experience and my passion for accessibility, and including accessibility best practices in creating not only your physical document, but actually when you're doing your presentation. So I think we've all started or either created a PowerPoint presentation or been to a PowerPoint presentation that was clearly using the default slide that showed up in PowerPoint. And I call it death by PowerPoint. I think we've all been to those presentations where it's like bullet point, bullet point. So cognitive research finds that people really can only focus on one topic at a time. We all like to think that we could multitask. I know I like to think that I can, and my husband's like, no, nobody can. It's true, you really can, not effectively. So in presentations, it's important that your slides ideally try to focus on one topic at a time. You might end up with an extremely long presentation, but you're not going to spend super long on each slide because you don't have a lot of content on them. One thing that I've noticed is, and in the research showed, that PowerPoint's default templates are really outdated. That bulleted list template hasn't changed since 1987. So it's high time that we get rid of that. There are a lot of other presentation softwares out there, Google Slides. This is actually in Google Slides. It doesn't necessarily feed you that default bullet point list, but I think we've all sort of gotten used to it. So I'm going to encourage you through this presentation to try to think outside the box next time. Think outside the bullet point next time. So I'm going to explain about what the assertion evidence method is. It is the most effective way to present scientific or technical information. I'm going to preface this entire presentation by saying this is not necessarily a scientific, like engineering presentation. I didn't conduct like outside field studies or demonstrations, but I do work for the Division of Agriculture, the Cooperative Extension Service. I do work with a lot of people who are scientists and conduct research. So part of this research was done for creating presentations to convince people of like a theory that has been proven with evidence. So studies suggest that presenters who use this model, this assertion evidence approach, you actually think more deeply when you're creating your actual presentation. You are taking on that cognitive load for your attendees. You're not giving them partial information like a little couple of words or the word topics and like a bunch of bullet points underneath it. That makes them have to not only listen to you, but also read your slides at the same time and fill in the blanks. That's a lot of work to put on people. And I don't know, most people don't have that kind of time, especially if they're in a conference. There's a bunch of, presentations they're going to go to. They're not going to remember what you're talking about because you're confusing them with a bunch of text and then a bunch of words. So instead, you need to use a message to help tell your story. And in this approach, you're going to build your talk on messages and not little keyword phrases or topics to tell a coherent and compelling story. If you've ever done any kind of content writing, blogging, social media, it's all about storytelling. Those are the kinds of things that's going to remind somebody. If you've watched or listened to a presentation, like TED Talks are kind of like that. They're usually telling a story through the whole thing. And setting up your slides in this way is going to help you do that. The effective assertion headlines that you're going to write are written in full sentences. So no more having like a word or a couple of words at the top. That's not a full sentence. If you can make sure that your first top sentence is a full sentence, and it's going to be some sort of assertion that says like this: effective assertion headlines are written in full sentences. They should be clear, concise, and provable with visual evidence, and written in no more than 2 lines. So you see, I've got 1.5 lines here. You're not going to write a whole paragraph up there. It's a quick, like if you're going to do a science research project, this is your 1 sentence. This is my theory. Here's what I'm going to prove. And the reason being is because people can read that and comprehend it, and they're not having to fill in the blanks from a half sentence or a couple of words. I'm going to repeat all of my main points throughout this so you can, again, remember what I'm talking about as I go through. Key takeaway number 1, build your talk on messages with those assertion headlines at the top in full sentences. And this all comes from that research article. If you want to read a little bit more about it, I found it really interesting. This is an example of a slide that I got that actually features this methodology in action. You can see here in this image, it's sort of a screenshot of a slide, and it says our back-end processing is highly accurate. Underneath, there's a chart that says company number 1, 85%, number 2, 90. Our company is 98%. Your assertion headline is that full sentence. Our back-end processing is highly accurate. And stuff below it is, oh yeah, show me. Well, in this case, it's shown in a chart, and that's your evidence. And this is a really good example of how you can actually make an assertion at the top and your evidence below it. They say through the research, images are, of course, worth 1,000 words, but they are the best supporting evidence. For each topic you have, include a picture, if you can, a diagram, a chart. In the realm of UX, it might be, we found that through our usability testing, users found clicking on the red button was 40% more effective or memorable than clicking on the blue link. Something like that. If you can pull that out, you're going to be able to convince somebody in a presentation a lot better. This graphic here says adding pictures leads to better recall. Usually if it's just words, and this I've seen this also with social media, 10% of people can remember just words. 65% are able to process pictures and words together. I know when I was doing my master's program, part of what they told us was if you have a button that says, checkout and the little checkout icon, those two together, paired together, it's that word reinforces the icon reinforces the word, and it makes it a little bit more memorable. My graphic design side is wanting to give you a few tips of design here. So if you can avoid general clip art, this goes to not just presentations, but kind of anything. That visual clutter is going to make people have a lot of problems processing information. So that visual clutter, don't have it in there if you don't need it. Decorative images are fine, but if they don't add anything to the presentation, I was in a presentation, I watched one yesterday, and a guy was trying to explain bridging the gap between like sales and production, which is fine, but he had a huge picture of like the Golden Gate Bridge. And I thought, well, what would have been more effective would have been bridging the gap between design or sales and production it results in 10% revenue gain. And then underneath that may be a chart that shows that. That's going to be better than like a decorative image of a bridge. I think that was just kind of a lazy slide that he put together, but it was a pretty picture. It just had nothing to do with what he was talking about. So using active negative space, everybody here has probably heard of negative space or white space. I know when I was in graphic design school, we called it negative space. They now call it white space, but don't be afraid of that. If you're putting a slide together, if you're putting a design together, it's okay to not cram something into every single space. Reducing that visual clutter, it's going to allow your audience to focus on your content and what you're saying and not really be distracted with a whole bunch of squished up words and content. So here's a really good example. I'm going to show you a bad slide example. This is actually taken from one of my colleagues. I'm not going to name names. Actually, I think he retired. Everybody retired this last year. I think he retired, so it's fine. He was one of our turf grass experts. And so his presentation, he's going to talk about lawn aeration. He's got a bunch of people he's talking to, trying to give the assertion that his demonstration was, effective in improving lawn aeration, improved grass. Well, he's going to talk about it here. He's got a bullet point. It's going to fly in. He's got a second bullet point, a third bullet point. Oh my gosh, we got a sub bullet point. Then we got a sub bullet point. And so you can see here, this is pretty much standard for a lot of presentations that I've been to. And it's just bullet point, bullet point, bullet point. Somebody's standing there talking about each bullet point. At some point, I'm going to zone out. I don't really know what they're trying to tell me. Instead, with the assertion evidence model, this is an example of taking that same information and using the assertion evidence model. So my assertion is proper lawn aeration improves grass quality. And I'm going to show that in a picture. Or I could have a chart here, whichever one. So in this case, on the left, I've got a picture of a pretty crappy looking lawn. I think it looks similar to my lawn, actually. I clearly need to aerate my lawn, but it's got yellow patches, it's got weeds, it looks pretty bad. And on the right, I see after aeration, I've got pretty green grass. It's really thick and luscious. It's like wonderful, like you're at a golf course or something. And if he were to be doing this presentation and he could say proper lawn aeration improves grass quality, here's the before and after from our plot demonstration. And then he could be giving all of that information instead of in the bullet points. These pictures are going to inspire him to talk about his methodology. So here's another example. We have pollinator experts and honeybee experts who work with me as well. So the assertion in this one is the clover and trefoil failed to attract pollinators in our field study. It's like literally a field study. They were in a field. And their evidence in this case is a chart. People love charts. People love graphs. People love infographics. Everybody likes a good, chart. I'm going to argue this chart is not the best one, but it's the one he had, but it is not really accessible. We could get into that. That's a whole other topic. But in any event, it is a chart and it has vegetative coverage. I've got data from 2016 and 2017. It says something there. Those two colored lines are not different enough in color for me, but I won't go down the rabbit hole of accessibility. But you can get the idea that his evidence is shown here in the chart. If he were to be giving this presentation, then he would be able to come in here and explain the process of, we did this with this percentage of the field. This is how much was covered in trefoil. This was clover. And over the years, blah, blah, blah. So this would actually give him some talking points and evidence. These are the kinds of slides, if you've been at a conference, that people are like taking pictures of from the back of the room. So that's the kind of thing that if you can make a slide like that, that's got some very memorable evidence, those are going to be the most effective. Recapping, told you I would recap. Takeaway number 2, use your images to support that full sentence assertion. And because they're a lot better than bullet points and slide design, and they help reduce that cognitive load on your audience. Another little tip, I'm a big fan of typography and fonts. So throughout this presentation, I've tried to keep the same font. It's Gill Sans. The bold font, they said in the research that I saw, bold fonts, of course, at the top for your assertions. That font at the very top is about 32 point, and I use about 18 to 24 point type for the body text. Don't go much below 18 Because if you've, again, ever been in a presentation and or on Zoom or in person, and you're in the back of the room and you're like squint, I don't know, I have to squint at this point in my life, squinting, I can't quite see the slides. So use a bigger font. And since you don't have a bunch of content on your slides, it's pretty bare, hopefully, or it has some pictures, then you're going to have enough room to make that font a little bit bigger. On the right, I have a chart that says Typography 101 and a whole bunch of different funky, like, ransom note type fonts over there. And you can do that if you're trying to make a point with a font, but don't be distracting with them. And ideally, your slide explanations, keep your slide explanations brief and clear. About 1.5 minutes per slide is what research says. This is probably the bane of my existence. If I've ever watched somebody read a slide out loud, please don't do that to me. I have gotten up and walked out of presentations because I'm like, I can read. This is not story time. I can read the slide myself. So, or just give me the slides and I'll just take them away and I don't even have to sit here and listen to you read out loud to me. So there's no point in doing that. And actually evidence bears that out. People want to see some either picture or graphic or something in your slide, and just avoid reading out loud from that. If you're going to read out loud from that, at least put them in your notes so everybody else isn't reading along with you like we're in kindergarten. Short lists, if you do have to have lists, I have found that there's sometimes you just have to have a list. Just keep them to, and this is probably the same research for like maybe web design or other things. Keep your text to 1 or 2 lines. Don't make them super long, and keep the list to no more than 2 to 4 items at most. I think I've got about 4 in some of mine, because after that, just break that up. If you realize you're in like 7 or 8 different bullet points, try to break that up at least into a couple of different slides. People aren't going to mind if you click to another slide. They don't actually know. They're not counting how many slides you have. So it's okay to break things up into, I think there's like 30 slides in this presentation, but I don't have a bunch of information on each one of them. Ideally, the knowledge that you give in a presentation is going to be in what you say and your experience. So it's going to be in the oral part of your presentation, not in the amount of information you're cramming onto the slide. It's a really hard habit to break. I used to do it. I went back to some of the slides I used to make when I first started at my job, and whoo, man, I was trying too hard. So you don't have to do that. Just go ahead and keep your slides, as the designers say, clean and really more impactful, because it's going to be easier for people to remember this stuff when they're going through your presentation. And practice. This was something I got off of the website Assertion-evidence.com. And it's kind of a little bit more geared. If you go to the website, it's a great website. It is a little more geared for like engineers and giving scientific talks. That's okay. There's no reason we can't take some of those good practices. Your evidence images are going to be your visual cues for what you're going to say. So if I were the bee expert talking about this clover and trefoil experiment, then I would probably be pretty excited because the scientists tend to get really excited about their experiments. And then I would be able to tell you, here's what's going on with the coverage in June and July. And, of course, make sure, again, that you're presenting to an audience that understands what you're talking about. I wouldn't advise giving this presentation to a bunch of people who were there for a cooking class or something, or if they're not on the same kind of education level. So again, you're going to know your audience. Again, like any good user researcher is going to do, they're going to know their audience and how they're going to present this information. Typically, the farmers and the people who are listening to these presentations kind of get all this, and the data there is not going to be too much over their heads. When I first did this presentation back in, I think it was 2019, I did it with a colleague who has since retired. I told you everybody retired. But he was actually a member of Toastmasters. He was a wonderful speaker. So I actually did the slide presentation part and he did the speaking part, and he was highly entertaining to watch. I'm not nearly as entertaining as he is. However, I will say that the research bears out that if you have a conversational style and you have a pretty good level of energy, that's the kind of thing that people are going to be reacting to. I just did a presentation a week ago, last Thursday. I did 2 of them. And the first one in the morning, it was one of the first ones I'd done in person a couple of years. And there were about 15, 20 people in this room. And I could look at them. You've got your eye contact, you're engaging with them. If somebody looks like they're a little bit bored, I might even point at them and say, what do you think about this or something? And I just know it's a little bit easier to present in person. On Zoom, not everybody has their camera on. So you're sort of I'm like talking to a lens here, but I know there's people on the other side of it. And it's important that you keep that energy up and make sure that people are listening to you, and hopefully I'm not droning on, but making sure that your point is made and you're getting a very clear speaking style going. If you use PowerPoint, the new version of PowerPoint, newer version of PowerPoint has a really cool thing called Presenter Coach in it. It is great. I've used it for this. It will tell you if you have too many ums and uhs, if your pace is too fast or too slow, your pitch. Are you going to modulate your voice and make sure that your voice comes in and out pretty nicely? It's really pretty cool. I highly, highly recommend it, especially if you want to get some practice under your belt. If you're nervous about presenting, almost everybody is. I used to be terrified of it, and now they made me do it so much at work. I guess I'll do it a lot now. So you do get used to it, but it helps to present because sometimes you don't have a practice audience, especially if you work remote. And so you can also record yourself on Zoom, watch yourself back. It's kind of awkward and cringy, but you can still do it. And I've really found that the Presenter Coach is a great thing. They do say on the Assertion-evidence website, I believe it said, present 10 times, practice it 10 times. And I thought, I don't know about that. I think if you can practice it 3 or 4 times to the point you feel comfortable, especially with your information, especially if you're the subject matter expert, it's going to go pretty well. Again, takeaway number 3, fashion your words on the spot. The Assertion-evidence website does say to not read directly from notes, although I did attend a presentation and a guy did a pretty good job reading from his notes. So it kind of depends on the presenter. Remain conversational and use your images to help you remember that message that you're trying to weave through the presentation. And also keep your voice as clear as possible, especially if you're not going to have a great connection or other people might not. It's good to sort of go back and repeat yourself if somebody says I couldn't hear that. And also, if you have a transcription happening, keeping your voice as clean as possible is going to help that transcription. I'm going to pivot just slightly to a little bit about accessibility. In this presentation, if you've noticed, I've been going through and describing the images as I've gone through them. If you show an image, the biggest thing you can do for accessibility as far as visual impairment audience members is to describe that picture out loud. One thing I did not do when I first started, because I thought you might think it's a little bit strange if you've not attended some accessibility presentations, is describe what I look like. So I attended a whole accessibility conference the last couple of days. And the first thing the speakers did was they would say, like, I'm a white female, I've got shoulder length curly hair, I'm wearing a flower necklace, and I have like a library Zoom background behind me. And it helps them sort of orient themselves with who's speaking. And also, if everybody could raise their hands, I would see, has anybody is anybody familiar with the term alt text and adding alt text to images? Okay. So some of you might be kind of new to that. It is incredibly important that when you're making your PowerPoint slides or your Google Slides or whatever they are, if you can right click, if you're on a PC, you can right click and you can add alt text to that picture. In this example on the right, I have a screenshot of the window. This is a very meta slide because this is a screenshot of the actual description I made of that icon that's over on the left. In the title, for some reason in Google Slides, it gives you a title. I don't know why, but the description says black line drawing of a profile of a face. Speech bubble holds a line drawing of an eye to indicate describing what you see. So that is what I might give if this were an actual photo of any consequence. I didn't do that, and I didn't describe all the icons you saw throughout there. If you could see all the icons, because those are really decorative. I didn't have the opportunity to mark these as decorative in Google Slides, but if you're in PowerPoint, you do have the option to tell the audience that it's a decorative image. So if somebody's got a screen reader and they're listening to the file being read out loud to them, it just ignores that picture entirely and it doesn't waste their time going through it. But if you do have a picture, like the grass pictures, like that chart, you're going to want to make sure to add that alt text in there. That way, if you do share your slides with somebody, even if that person isn't visually impaired, they might share the slides with somebody who is, or it might make its way over, or this is what happens to us all the time. Oh, I didn't mean for that to get on the website. Well, once it's on your website, you're liable for it. And especially if you work in a government industry like I do, you have to comply by Section 508 guidelines and accessibility WCAG guidelines, which they're coming out with 2.2 very soon. So it's important that these are the bare minimum things that you do for accessibility in your presentation. And it's just the nicest, it's an ethical and legal thing to do with regards to accessibility. If you do use PowerPoint, there's an accessibility checker. All Microsoft products do have an accessibility checker. That's in Word, that's in Excel. Do not use Publisher if you want to make accessible files. There are several issues with Publisher. I don't know why Microsoft still uses Publisher, but they should get rid of it because they're not supporting accessibility in it for some reason. But PowerPoint does have an accessibility checker in it. And what it'll do is it'll go through all of your slides. It does take a little while, but it's going to flag anything. Is this going to be a decorative image? Do you need to add an alt text to it to describe the image to somebody using a screen reader? The other thing it's going to do is have you create the reading order on each slide. So once the screen reader hits it, you know, in PowerPoint, like here, I've got my title, I've got my text, and I've got my picture. Well, it'll give you the opportunity to say, in what order do you want all of that to be read out loud? And it's really important because in PowerPoint, sometimes you can put a picture over here and a picture over here, or it flies in. Yeah, avoid animation. That's not very accessible, by the way. So those are the kinds of things that you're going to do. It does take a little while, but if you weave accessibility best practices into your workflow, then it doesn't take as long to make your files accessible. If anybody's interested in file accessibility, I do that quite a bit as part of my job. So it's a really important skill to have. And if you don't know a lot about it, you probably will in the future because more organizations are being sued for inaccessible files and websites. We are actually bound also to make sure that our files that we email to people are accessible, not just the ones on the website. So it's important to know all of these things. And it's just the responsible thing to do if you are going to make a presentation to the public. Takeaway number 4, describe your images in your presentation. Make your file accessible with alt text metadata. I didn't talk about that, but it's the metadata information that's in part of your file. It doesn't get caught in that accessibility checker. It's super easy to add. And then your heading levels. There are a couple of other inclusivity best practices. Try not to use gendered language. And this presentation doesn't have an issue with color contrast, but make sure that you don't have funky color contrast like lime green background with yellow text on top. That's not going to be very readable for people with low visibility or low vision or color blindness. All right, I'm going to wrap up with the 4 key principle countdown. Build your talk on those full sentence messages, not topics. Support those messages with your visual evidence. Avoid bullet lists if you can. Explain that evidence by fashioning words on the spot. Try not to read your presentation out loud. If you can avoid it, use those images to inspire you to talk about what you're good at talking about. And then, of course, my favorite, including accessibility best practices in your presentation itself and in the slides. If you do want to have a template, if you want to kind of get a look at this, this is the Assertion-evidence.com. It is not a pretty website. I will tell you that right now. I'm not even sure it's an accessible website. It looks pretty dated, but you know, it's engineers built it. So it's an interesting website. It's got a lot of examples of how people do their presentations. It's got video examples, it's got templates, it's got teaching methods and guides. It's really a great resource. It doesn't look pretty, but it's really a great resource. So that I'm at the end of my presentation. Hopefully you learned at least one or two things in here. Feel free to reach out to me and contact me if you have any questions. If you want to learn more about anything I've spoken about tonight, I'm happy to do that. And I don't know if we had any questions in the chat, but feel free if you want to unmute and ask them now. I think we're ready for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was great. Yeah, I didn't know anything about the PowerPoint coach. That's something I've never heard of. And the alt images and things in the accessibility in the PowerPoint slides itself. Didn't even think about that. I think about website and things like that. And the fact that you are doing email, that's really interesting. And Susan's been to accessibility groups for a while, and it's just amazing what they're coming out with now. So
yeah, it's a huge industry. There are a lot of places. I hate to say they're kind of they're working backwards. They're not being as proactive, they're being a little reactive with it. So it definitely dovetails into UX and usability. So there's accessibility and usability overlaps.
Sure.
Right.
Absolutely.
Accessibility helps everybody. And it is a wonderful specialty to add to your career. It
Yes.
makes you very desirable.
Yes.
Yes.
I do a lot of teaching. One of the first questions they asked me when I interviewed for this job a while back was, what do you know about accessibility? And we didn't really do a lot of that when we worked together. I know Sherry, I didn't know a lot about it. And over the years, it's just become more and more important. And if you've heard of the WCAG 2.1, it's going to be 2.2 very soon. They're going to come out with 3.0 pretty soon, actually. So it's going forward pretty quickly, and the laws are each state is a little bit different, but there's lawsuits left and right. I think there were like 4,000 last year alone. And so it's important to get ahead of it, because it's part of my job is to get ahead of it, get some accessibility scores for our website, make sure that we're not going backwards we have like 100 people who edit our website. So I have to maintain the integrity of the site. And so part of my job is to educate them on, here's how you own your own content. I'm not going to fix it for you. It's not IT's problem. It is everybody's responsibility. And so if I teach them these little tips, it's just going to make everything better.
Mm-hmm.
Bianca has a good question in chat. Bianca, do you want to come off mute and say it, or do you want me to read it?
Yeah, I can say it.
See.
Amy, thank you for the presentation of this all. It's really great. Is there any kind of best practice that you have found when trying to get audience participation?
Oh, yes. So if you're one of the things that we've done here where I work, we've used Zoom for many, many years. So in Zoom itself, that could be a whole presentation of polls and asking people to unmute. And there's like a thing like a whiteboard. I know in Zoom, there's other different things that you can do. And you can do little collaborations. You can do little breakout rooms and stuff like that. I think polls are the main thing that either a pre-session poll where like, here, tell me what you know. What is your assessment of knowing something about this topic? And then, okay, well, I'm going to stop it now. And then everybody put in the chat an answer to this question. Those are the kinds of things that, as far as if you're remote presenting, those are a great way to get people to pay attention. In person, we've done, there's some software that you can use that they can download to their phone, and they can just like interact with a little quiz or survey or something like that. So those are things, I didn't touch on that tonight, but that is something that we found people just will just kind of shake awake and like pay attention if they've got a poll. It depends on the platform you're using. Sometimes they can be kind of cantankerous in Zoom. Like you've got to have somebody managing the meeting that knows how to deal with them. We luckily had somebody on our team that did.
Kendall's mentioning Mentimeter, which is a good interaction platform too.
I've not used that one. That sounds awesome.
It's a really good one. Kendall, you want to come off mute and talk about it?
Yeah, we've used it. I teach at a physical therapy school, and we've used Mentimeter, and you can do quizzes. But I agree, Amy. Somebody has to be wrangling it. Yeah, so you're sharing. You have to have two presenters, and so it does get a little challenging. I think another one is Kahoot. It's more like a kid's game.
Oh yeah.
But yeah.
Our 4-H group uses Kahoots quite a bit, and it's a great way to get people to not get super bored in a presentation, especially younger people. They tend to get like a little zoned out.
And everybody does. You get kind of lulled into a
Oh, yeah.
content consumption mode where it's, we all spend too much time on watching streaming services and whatnot, right?
Oh
Binge
yeah.
watching, and it can become like that where you're just passive.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes I've asked questions, and a lot of people may not have the ability to turn their camera on. So it's a little hard to say, raise your hand. So you can maybe ask, like, give a reaction or something like that. In fact, I got my UX certification via Zoom. It was all done remotely on Nielsen Norman because it was in 2020 when they went remote. So I had the opportunity to do it all online, and they did a lot of breakout work with us. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of how they kept us engaged. I'm going to have to look up that Mentimeter though. Lida or Lida, you have a question about typography.
It's Lida. Hi.
Okay. Hi.
Thank you, Amy, for the tips you gave in the presentation. I actually had a question about one of your slides that you mentioned, typography 32 bold sans serif. It reminded me of a blog that I read a while ago that actually serif fonts may be better for dyslexic people. So I was wondering if you have come across a research that states such a thing.
Yeah, I've heard both. The latest research I saw said sans serif is better. It depends on the type of reader that you've got. I had always heard serif fonts were easier to read in like a body copy, but sans serif was easier to read in a big bolder headline copy. And so that's what I have heard. Everybody's a little bit different. I just know that for years I heard serif fonts were better. And then I'd say in the past 3 or 4 years, I've heard the opposite. And it could be that screens are bigger now. I don't know. All I know is that the research that I saw in, I think it was the Assertion-evidence website, said sans serif fonts. But I mean, it just kind of depends. I love all fonts. I'm a big fan of serif fonts personally, just because I like kind of the classic look. But it also will impact whatever it is you're talking about. So if you're talking about something a little more traditional or classic, a serif font is really nice. Baskerville is one of my favorites. But not everybody has it. So I would recommend that if you are going to share your slides with somebody, like if I was going to share my PowerPoint slides, use a font that's pretty ubiquitous and it's available everywhere. Because otherwise, if you've gotten some funky font that you've downloaded off Font Squirrel, which is a great site, by the way, if you want to download fun fonts, but nobody else is going to have that font, and it's going to be a replacement font, and then your slide's going to look really funky on their side. So, but yeah, it's to me, it's a little bit matter of opinion. But I just know that on digital sides, I think people do tend to look at the serif fonts a little bit more favorably. So,
All right, thank you.